Good morning, friends. We are on Chapter 49, The Criminal Case, Southwest Virginia. Late at night, on October 24, 2006, John Brownlee, the U.S. Attorney in Western Virginia, received a phone call at home. On the line was Michael J. Elston. Elston worked in the U.S. Department of Justice, while Alberto Gonzalez was Attorney General for President George W. Bush. Elston said he was calling on behalf of the Purdue Pharma executive. The investigation Brownlee had approved into Purdue Pharma and its campaign to market OxyContin was then 4 years old. The case was assigned to the tiny Abingdon, Virginia office near Kentucky and West Virginia, a coal mining region where hundreds of people had died of OxyContin overdoses. The office issued hundreds of subpoenas, scanned stacks of documents into a database, and interviewed dozens of people. By 2006, Brownlee's staff believed they had evidence that the company had knowingly misbranded OxyContin as virtually non-addictive. In Purdue focus groups, doctors worried about OxyContin's addictiveness but yearned for a long-lasting and less addictive painkiller. The company that produced a non-addictive painkiller would dominate the pain management market, and that is exactly what Purdue tried to do, Brownlee testified later. Purdue marketed and promoted OxyContin as less addictive, less subject to abuse and diversion, and less likely to cause tolerance and withdrawal than other pain medications. Despite its ad claims, Purdue provided no study to the FDA. Investigators later noted that supported those claims. The company taught its sales force that oxycodone was harder to extract and thus abuse than other drugs, though the company's own studies showed that wasn't true. In 1995 tests, the company found that 68% of the oxycodone that could be extracted when the pill was crushed and liquefied and drawn through cotton into a syringe. In fact, addicts I spoke with said it was easier to extract the drug from an OxyContin pill than from other milder opiate painkillers such as Vicodin or Lortab, because OxyContin didn't include anything but oxycodone, while the others also contained acetaminophen or Tylenol. The company's sales staff said in promotional meetings across the United States that OxyContin's 12-hour timed-release formula meant there were fewer peaks and troughs in euphoria than compared with immediate-release opiates. This was a crucial point. Intense euphoria followed by an intense crash is what produces the cravings, leading to addiction to opiates. If OxyContin didn't cause these extreme peaks and troughs, then its salespeople could claim to physicians that the pills carried less risk of addiction than short-acting opiates. I spoke with several doctors who said the graphs were showing OxyContin's purportedly mild peaks and troughs of oxycodone in blood plasma were among the most convincing data that Purdue salespeople produced. But federal investigators later said that these graphs were incorrect and falsely exaggerated in the difference in euphoric effect between Oxy and its short-acting competitors. Purdue phonied up those graphs to show a steady level of oxycodone in blood plasmas, said Paul Hanley, a New York City plaintiff's attorney, who brought a class-action lawsuit against Purdue. The true graph shows an incredible spike, then boom, you go straight to the bottom. Purdue supervisors taught the salespeople to tell doctors that patients using up to 60 milligrams of OxyContin could stop abruptly without withdrawal symptoms. However, federal investigators found that company officials knew of a 2001 British study of osteoporosis patients who described suffering withdrawal when they stopped using OxyContin. Even after receiving this information, federal investigators wrote, supervisors and employees decided not to write up the findings because of a concern that it might add to the current negative press surrounding OxyContin. As I was writing this book, I contacted Purdue's media representatives requesting an interview with someone at the company about the 2006 criminal case. I inquired about its ad campaign and how OxyContin was selling lately, among other things. I asked also for interviews with Dr. David Haddix, author of The Concept of Pseudo-Addiction, and with Dr. Curtis Wright, who had been part of approving Purdue's application while he was at the FDA. A company spokesman said the following. For more than 30 years, Purdue Pharma has developed opioid medications to alleviate the debilitating pain experienced by millions of people. As leaders in our field, we are acutely aware of the public health risks that can arise from the misuse and abuse of these medications. We're working with policymakers and healthcare professionals throughout the country to reduce the risks involving opioids without compromising the medical care of people suffering from chronic pain. Purdue is developing innovative technologies to create pain medicines in new forms that include abuse deterrent properties, making them unattractive to drug abusers. These medicines are designed to provide patients with pain relief when taken as directed, while also deterring abuse of snorting and injection. These new approaches do not prevent abuse, but they are a step in the right direction. We encourage a transition to abuse-deterrent technologies over time, but it must be accompanied by greater societal efforts to reduce the demand for non-medical use of prescription medications. In 2005, the federal prosecutors in Abingdon, Virginia, who were preparing the case against Purdue, subpoenaed Dr. Herschel Jick up to Boston University. A deputy sheriff delivered the papers. Dr. Jick ignored the subpoena at first. He was too busy to be bothered. Then a federal prosecutor called. They needed him to testify before a grand jury, she said, something to the effect. Dr. Jick later remembered of a drug company using his 1980 letter to the New England Journal of Medicine as proof that their drugs weren't addictive. Herschel Jick was perplexed. He had no idea what she was talking about. What did all this have to do with him? I told them I wouldn't go, he told me. But they threatened to put me in jail, so I schlepped on down there. They had me on the stand, asking me irrelevant and obtuse questions for about 2 hours. Dr. Jick then returned to Boston, and with that he exited our story. His tiny letter to the editor in the back pages of a New England Journal of Medicine having helped ignite, quite unintentionally, a revolution in American medicine. In Abingdon, the case against Purdue proceeded. John Brownlee filed criminal charges against the pharmaceutical company. He set October 25th as a deadline for Purdue to accept a plea agreement. In the plea, the company would admit to one felony count of false branding of OxyContin, or face further charges. In later testimony before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, Brownlee said Michael Elston asked him during his phone call to slow the case, postpone the plea agreement. Elston later said he was calling on behalf of a superior, who in turn received a call from Purdue defense attorney asking for more time for the company. Brownlee thought about the request. It was a delicate matter. His political career showed promise. He was being mentioned as a potential candidate for state attorney general, even governor. Still, he saw no reason to postpone the long and complicated case. That afternoon, he had received approval from DOJ higher-ups to proceed with it. He said he told Elston to go away. Brownlee signed the plea agreement with Purdue the next morning. 8 days later, his name showed up on a list compiled by Elston of federal prosecutors recommended to be fired. 9 were fired. In the end, John Brownlee was not one of them, but he testified the next year he believed his inclusion on the list was retaliation for not delaying the Purdue settlement. The Purdue episode lingered amid the Bush administration controversy, in which top attorney general officials were accused of political meddling in the work of their far-flung prosecutors and recommending some be fired for not complying with what were perceived as political orders. Elston later resigned. An attorney for Elston told the Washington Post later that there was no connection between the phone call that night and Brownlee's name appearing on the list of prosecutors recommending to be fired. John Brownlee spent another year as the U.S. Attorney from Western Virginia. In 2008, he resigned to seek the Republican nomination for state general attorney and lost in the primary. Talk of a future gubernatorial bid wilted. His political career stalled. He is now in private practice. However, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to a felony count of misbranding OxyContin. To avoid federal prison sentences for its executives, the company paid $634.5 million fine, among the largest in the history of a pharmaceutical industry at the time. 3 executives, CEO Michael Friedman, General Counsel Howard Udell, and the by then departed Chief Medical Officer Dr. Paul Goldenheim, paid $34.5 million of that. Each pleaded guilty to a single misdemeanor of misbranding the drug. They were also placed on probation for 3 years and ordered to perform 400 hours of community service. In July 2007, the Purdue executives appeared in federal court for sentencing. Lee Nuss, the mother of a Florida man who died of an OxyContin overdose, rose to speak. "You are," she told them, "nothing more than a large corporate drug cartel." About this time, over in southern Ohio, Dr. Philip Pryor had left private family practice to devote himself full-time to his specialty in addiction medicine at the Veterans Administration Hospital in the town of Chillicothe. Pryor was one of the few addiction specialists in southern Ohio, and this made him something akin to a battlefield medic. The area around Chillicothe had seen drug problems before, but they'd never involved opiates. Not long after the Purdue campaign hit full swing, however, Chillicothe and the surrounding towns began seeing patients addicted to OxyContin. Many of them used hundreds of milligrams a day as their tolerance grew. Newly liberal prescribing put oxys everywhere. Pill mills sprouted like fungus. Soon opiate pills were the party drug for small-town kids who in another era might have been building bonfires and getting drunk. Then Pryor watched in amazement as heroin came to town. Heroin was as foreign to this rural, white communities of southern Ohio as extraterrestrials. Wasn't it an urban drug for blacks in Baltimore or D.C., Puerto Ricans in New York? It had never had anything to do with Appalachia. This heroin, too, was like nothing Pryor had ever seen, even in movies. It was sticky and dark brown, like rat crap, yet potent and above all cheap. It was called black tar. In Columbus, Mexicans were delivering it by car like pizza, at prices that were a fourth what Oxy cost and offering volume discounts. In Chillicothe and towns around Fairfield County, every addict became their salesman, looking for new clients they could parlay into enough orders to make a trip to Columbus worthwhile. From Fairfield County, the news marched south, down through a region where Oxycontin had already tenderized a generation of folks to opiate use. Athens County, 90 miles southeast of Columbus, had seen almost no heroin ever. By 2008, 15% of the admissions to a treatment center there were related to heroin, and almost all were interjecting it. In 2012, the center was treating more heroin addicts, mostly for black tar, than alcoholics. And so it went. Oxycontin first, introduced by reps from Purdue Pharma over steak and dessert in the air-conditioned doctors' offices. Within a few years, black tar heroin followed in tiny, uninflated balloons held in the mouths of sugarcane farm boys from Jalisco driving old Nissan Sentras to meetups in McDonald's parking lots. Others, too, got in on the trade. Black guys from Detroit and Dayton discovered southern Ohio and brought powder heroin. Philip Pryor, who is now knee-deep in what was unthinkable a few years before, rural, white heroin junkies. "I've yet to find one who didn't start with Oxycontin," he said. "They wouldn't be selling this quantity of heroin on the street right now if they hadn't made these decisions in the boardroom." Have a good day, friends.